My name is Dan Bubniak, and I'm a certified EOS implementer. I want to talk about the scorecard today and help you think about how do we advance that scorecard to the next level. So first, I want to start at a high level. What is the scorecard? Why does it matter? And let's look at it from 30,000 feet up. So at a high level in EOS, there are five major tools that drive 80% of everything in EOS, right? And scorecard is one of them. So the first tool, though, is the vision traction organizer. This is where we're going to create that vision for where the business is going and how it's going to get there. Now, that's kind of the center stone for everything. And at that level, what we're ultimately doing is then taking the accountability chart and saying, this is the management team and team in the business that we're hiring to execute that vision, right? And so we've got to make sure we have the right people in the right seats on that accountability chart. But let's assume we do, right? So we got that vision. We've hired our leadership team through the accountability chart. And then what we do is we have two main tools kind of in that day-to-day bump and grind. And that's the rocks and the scorecard. But these are very different tools. Whereas the rocks are more about improvements, right? Or about those benchmarks, those milestones that move a business or department forward. So these are things like hiring major positions or making major people changes. They could be things like launching new products or services. They could be kind of implementing that new CRM, right? These are these things that are outside of the day-to-day weeds, but actually improve the business. Whereas the scorecard is kind of the opposite. It's all about execution, right? Are we performing appropriately? Do we have that quality coming out? Are the departments functioning as they should be, right? So that's kind of, are we winning from an execution perspective, is that scorecard. So those are two very different tools. And lastly, that L10 is that fifth tool that allows us to keep everything in sync. So when those rocks are falling off or the scorecard is falling off, we have that mechanism to get those things back on track. So at a high level, I just want to highlight that rocks are really about improvements and scorecard is all about execution. So another major point here is scorecard's about being proactive, right? Most leadership teams get to the end of the month or the quarter and they get surprised by results. And that's because they didn't have a pulse on the business. So what we're trying to do with the scorecard is give us a pulse on the business consistently on a weekly basis, put us on our toes. And when we start to see problems, we can address them quickly, right? And get into that proactive frame of mind, or what are we going to do to get back on track? So that's what the scorecard is there for. Now, the third bullet here, and I think this is the most important thing that's misunderstood, is scorecard isn't about keeping score. I hear it often that we have to have this revenue number or this year over year number on the scorecard because we have to know this information. And this is not about knowing information. That's not what the scorecard ultimately is about. This isn't in lieu of a monthly financial meeting or, a deep dive quarterly. Still have those things. This is about creating a bias towards action. So when you have a scorecard with specific measurables, what we're trying to do is get that leadership team, when something is falling off, to change their mindset, get a little anxious, and take an action in the next 7 days. That's what the scorecard is there for, is to change behavior. And so you don't have to have like a monthly or quarterly metric on your weekly scorecard. Still measure those things monthly or quarterly. What we want to have on that scorecard are, what are those things that I see on a weekly basis that causes me to drive action and change my behavior? That's what this scorecard is about. The last thing here is leadership scorecard takes generally 3 to 12 months to feel like you got it right? So if you're in the first couple of months, first 2, 3, 4, even 4, 5, 6 months, and you're not feeling like you love it, just take a step back, take a deep breath. That is normal. What ultimately matters in the early part of the journey is to get the habit of measuring weekly down, right? Get that new discipline, that habit going. So start with version 1. If it's very far off from being perfect, doesn't ultimately matter in the beginning. We just want to get that habit going. And then what you need to do as a leadership team is continuously iterate, make it better every single week, every quarter, every month. If you need to adjust something, do it, right? You'll ultimately get to the point that you love it through a couple of months of iteration. So just get going. Now, the 6 fundamentals of a scorecard. So when you're putting a scorecard in place, what we're going to do here is we want to review this weekly as a leadership team, every single week in that level 10 meeting. It's got to be 5 to 15 numbers, right? Less is more. If you measure everything, everything is confusing. You don't know where the real problems are. We want to distill that down to what are the most important numbers in the business. And we ultimately want these to be activity-based leading indicators. Things that, again, when they're falling off, I know that I can do something about it within the next week. Number 3, one person has to be accountable for each. So when the thing falls off, who is accountable to make it get back on track? So one person. There's got to be a goal. So how do we know if we won or lost that week? We need to know what that goal needs to look like. And that goal shouldn't be a stretch goal. It should be, if it's beneath it, I need to get it above that line in the next kind of 7 days, right? If it's impossible for me to get it there in the next 7 days, that's a stretch goal, right? Don't make it impossible. We want to make sure we can get there in the next 7 days. If the goal isn't hit, it should be going down onto your issues list in your level 10 meeting. We should discuss it. And then we want to see these things over 13 weeks, right? Because the goal here is to be proactive and see patterns and trends so we can get better at predicting the future. So the first way to kind of set that scorecard, right? And if you're struggling with your scorecard, step back, run this exercise. This is what we call the pilot's cockpit exercise. And if you walk into a pilot's cockpit and you see all these knobs and switches and indicators on that top and bottom, it's really confusing and there's flashing lights everywhere. You don't know what's going on. It's pretty distracting. But what the pilot knows that I don't know is if you see this little circle, there's that central indicator panel of 6 indicators, right? And if those 6 things are green, we're good, right? The pilots aren't looking at any other flashing lights and indicators. And those 6 things could ultimately be things like, is the engine working properly? Is the weather correct, right? Is the weather not a problem? Are the wings working? Are the wheels working? It's kind of those 6 main things that if I know those things are working, I'm good. I don't have to look at anything else. Now, if the weather is flashing that, hey, we have snow coming, well, then, yeah, there's probably 5 other indicators that I need to look at, right? Is the de-icers working, right? But those 6 things tell us if there's an issue, and then we can go deeper. So the goal for our business is to figure out what are those 6 things, or 5 to 15 in our for purposes of the scorecard, 5 to 15 indicators in the business that tell us, are we getting to where we're going safely and on time, right? That's what we're trying to do in setting our scorecard here. So what is that central panel for your business? Another exercise you could look at it is called the I'm on an island exercise, where if you imagine that you're, the leader of the business, running the business, and you go on vacation, right? And you're sitting on that island, you have no access to phone, internet or anything. And you get a kind of message in a bottle is floating in the ocean, and you open that bottle and it's 1 page and it tells you a couple of numbers. What are the numbers that tell you can sit back, right, kick your feet up and drink that pina colada, versus the numbers that tell you, oh, if this is off, like I'm throwing that pina colada and going into the ocean and swimming back home? What would those numbers be that would tell you, is the business working or not? So those are 2 high-level exercises to get you to step back and think, what are those most critical numbers, distilled down, simplified, that give me the pulse of the business? So my favorite way to come down to what measurables what options are, is to look at your accountability chart. So pull up the accountability chart, and these are going to tell you what are the core functions of the business that need to be operating. So I think of them as machines, right? You have the marketing machine. So if the accountability chart, for example, has 5 core functions on our leadership team, we have 5 main machines in the business that need to be operating to keep the business moving, right? So we have a marketing machine, we have a sales machine, we have an operations machine, a finance machine, and an HR machine. Now we need to distill down what are the outputs of these machines that we know that it's working, and really simplify it into a bullet or 2. So in this example, the marketing machine, I know if this machine is functioning if it's generating qualified leads. That's why this function exists. If it's outputting those, I know it's working. In the sales machine, I know if that machine is working if we're taking those leads and converting them to customers, and if our current accounts are growing. So that's how I know that machine is working. My operations machine, I know if it's working if we're highly productive and we have happy customers. So what is the big goal of each function? How do we know that each machine is functioning? When you go through that exercise, then some obvious indicators are going to pop up. How can I measure if those things are happening? So in this example, for marketing, right, the marketing machine's working if I'm generating qualified leads. Well, there's 2 obvious indicators then that tell me if that's happening or going to happen, right? New leads, first sales appointments. That's telling me, is the marketing department outputting those qualified leads? From a sales perspective, again, we want to turn those leads into customers and grow our current accounts. So some obvious indicators or options that could go in our scorecard is, what are those proposals going out, right? What are those proposals that are getting a 1? And then upsells would be an indicator of are we actually growing our current accounts? Operations, right? If we want to have high productivity, it means is our staff, if we have 40 hours in a work week, right? Are they actually working 40 hours, right? That would be something like an efficiency metric. Dollars delivered would be, if we have a specific output we need on a weekly basis to continue our demand, right? Meet our demand of our customers. That could be a dollars delivered thing, that we're highly productive if we're meeting that demand. And then a backlog would tell us what's not getting done, right? Or what's in the pipeline. These are things that are going to tell us if we are productive in our business. And ultimately, if we're productive, we should have happy customers. So this is just a basic high-level exercise that could allow you to look at each major function as a machine and what does that machine need to output. When you do that, a lot of the times it becomes obvious as to what are those measurables that are telling us if that machine is outputting what it needs. So that's the first way to do it. Another way to do it is to think about, it's called getting what you want. And what you're ultimately going to do in this exercise is think about, what do I want at the end of the day, right? So I'm an EOS implementer. This is my business. This is actually an example of what's on my scorecard. Now I start with, what do I want? And I'm putting myself in the sales seat on my accountability chart. So what do I want if I'm in the sales seat? I want a new client a month, right? If I get one new client a month, that is telling me that my sales function is working, right? One new client gets me to where I want to go as a business owner. Now you're going to work backwards. So start at the end. Well, what's before getting a new client? For me, it's called a 90-minute meeting, which is ultimately the last step in my sales process. Someone who is highly interested in EOS and is at the decision phase. So is that the 90-minute meeting for me? Well, the step before getting someone to a 90-minute meeting is an overview conversation where somebody, again, very interested in EOS, not all the way there, but interested. That's before the 90-minute meeting. And then before that is where somebody is kind of having that first interested touch point, right? I'm kind of interested. I want to learn more. That's that warm lead convo. And then before that is just prospecting, right? That would be things like going to events, cold calls, conversations with business owners, that type of stuff. So in this getting what you want, when I start at the end with, I want one new client, and then work backwards in the process, there are 5 major steps in my sales process. There's 5 options of things that I could measure on my scorecard that's going to tell me, is my sales machine working? What happens to be on my scorecard, for example, is going to be that prospect touches. I actually put it as conversations with business owners is on my scorecard. I need 15 of those a week, right? 60 on the month. So this is on a monthly basis, 15 a week for me to get to that one new client. And then that 90-minute meeting I also have on my scorecard, which is telling me, are those that prospecting, is it actually converting and moving us down the funnel? So those are 2 things that are on my scorecard. So for you, look at each function. What do I want out of this function? What is that end result? And then work backwards in the process, and you'll have, 5 options of things that could go on your scorecard for each of these. An example of this in an actual accounts receivable process would be, again, if we want to deposit cash at the end is the ultimate goal of the accounts receivable, the finance function. We've got that, the step before that is a 40-day notification if someone's late, and a 30-day notification, a 20-day follow-up call, a 10-day follow-up email. And this first step is sending an invoice. So these are all things that you could measure throughout the process to say, is it working, right? So you could go all the way to the end. If someone at that, AR over 45 days is telling you, okay, we're losing the game here, right? If that number is climbing. You could also go in the middle of the process of AR at 30 days is kind of give you an early indicator warning of, AR that's decaying over time. That could be on your scorecard. Or you could just think about that, the sending invoices could be on your scorecard. How many invoices did we send on time? Do we want that to be 100%, right? So that's something that could be on your scorecard. That's essentially saying, are we going to get to that ultimate deposit cash outcome? So some major tips here, right? A couple of them. I'm going to walk through them of ways, again, to get measurables on that scorecard. This is one of my favorite ones, is if something isn't happening that should be, and vice versa. If you want something to happen that isn't happening, put it on your scorecard, because this is the tool to drive action. So I'll give you an example. I had one client that was having a lot of errors. They were manufacturing a lot of errors in their process. So they're getting through the manufacturing process and a ton of errors were happening. and they wanted that to stop happening, right? We don't want errors. So, I asked them the question, is this on your scorecard? And they said no. And I said, well, let's get it on the scorecard, right? Because the scorecard is all about driving action. When you put a spotlight on something and then someone's reporting on it weekly, well, they don't want to get embarrassed. They want to see that number start decreasing. They don't want it to continuously pop up on the issues list. And so we put the errors on the scorecard, and all of a sudden, over 4 or 8 weeks, the errors started going away. That's what this tool is, right? This is a tool like sunlight is the best disinfectant. When you put something on the scorecard, it's sunlight, it's a spotlight on that item. And organically, when someone's accountable for it and has to report on it on a weekly basis, it goes away. So if you want something to start happening or stop happening, put it on the scorecard. The second thing is scorecards should be assessed quarterly with goals that align to financial targets. So when you go into a quarterly and we're going to look at forward and set those, revenue and profit targets, well, I would also ask you to look at your scorecard and say, do the goals on each measurable get me to those financial outcomes? Because if they do, then we just got to keep the scorecard green. If you keep the scorecard green, you're going to hit those financial targets. The third thing here is scorecard is a tool. It's a mechanism simply to move the teams towards action. So this is dynamic and it should be treated dynamic. I have an example of, a client that, they sell into grocery stores, but the grocery stores only take meetings in, the months of June and September. And so, they want the team heavily focused on getting into those meetings in June and then in September. Well, there aren't any meetings in Q1, right? So we're probably not putting measurables in Q1 around getting into meetings, whereas in June and September and those Q2, Q3 on our scorecard, we probably have measurables about getting into those meetings. So the scorecard is a dynamic. And if we have those measurables, let's say in June about, meetings scheduled with the buyer, we're putting spotlights on it and it's making sure the team is focused on driving action in that month. So the scorecard is dynamic. You should use it as a tool to drive action in the business. And it should change based on what activities happen when throughout the year, throughout the quarters in your business, which gets me to number 4. It's the same thing with the seasonal business. You should look at where you are in the quarter, what activities happen within that quarter, and adjust the scorecard to make that happen. So for example, I have a greenhouse business that all of their actual planting and growing activities happen within the first 2 quarters. And then the third and fourth quarter, there isn't any of that. So it should be a completely different scorecard in Q1, Q2, because there are completely different activities. And then at the end of Q2, we should step back and completely adjust the scorecard to say, well, what activities do we want in Q3 and Q4? Maybe it's not growing. Maybe it's things like, getting dead inventory out. Or activities around doing R&D for the next season. So completely different activities. We should treat that scorecard towards driving activities based on the seasonality in the business. Number 5 here is the scorecard is ultimately at the leadership scorecard, it's ultimately the integrator scorecard. Because remember, the integrator is hired essentially to execute the business plan, to make sure we hit those financial targets and the business plan is happening. So if you're like, everybody is kind of arguing at the leadership team level as what should be there, what shouldn't be there, I'm going to look at that integrator and say, we're stuck. You tell me. This is your scorecard. Let's get us to the finish line. Make the decision. What do you need as the integrator to know if we're going to hit the financial plan and business plan? Make the decision and move on. So if you're stuck, integrator, I'm looking at you. Get us to the finish line. Let's make a decision and then iterate as you go if it's wrong. Number 6 here is the scorecard can help you find capacity. So I have a lot of the times, in the beginning, early days where we go and set that scorecard and then we ask, what is the goal? And people say, we don't know. We haven't done this before. Well, I say, let's just get a goal in there, right? What do we think it should be? And then if you got it wrong, use the scorecard to find capacity, right? So if we set that number and we're constantly way over and overachieving on the goal, we'll move the goal up. And if we're way underachieving on the goal and it's impossible for us to get to that goal in the next 7 days, move the goal down. Let's find that capacity. And ultimately, what we want that goal to be is what is the number that if it's below that line, we're immediately taking action and we can get it back above that line in the next 7 days. Number 7 is stop overcomplicating it, right? If you're like going week over week, month over month, every single L10, spending all the time trying to adjust your scorecard, you're overcomplicating it. let's just get to the first version and move on, right? Because what happens is once you just do and try, then you're going to find what's working, what's not, and then iterate as you go. Number 8 here is if a measurable is driving bad behavior, try adding a contra measurable. So the example that I gave you prior in my scorecard was prospecting, right? How many conversations with business owners am I having? And then at the end, are those actually converting? So that's an example of a measurable and a contra measurable where sometimes, I'll see on a sales scorecard, they'll put, warm leads and, or just leads. And then the sales team is going out and they're just getting leads, even if they're not even qualified leads. So it's actually driving bad behavior. So what you would do in that instance is we'll put a contra measurable that's defining, well, is it turning into good behavior? So leads into actual, warm leads or contracts or whatever. It's telling you, are those beginning of the funnel things turning into good behavior? So that's an example of a contra measurable that can take bad behavior and then make it good behavior by measuring the flip side of it. Then lastly, the whole entire point of the scorecard is to not get used to red, right? So what this is supposed to do is if I see it red, I immediately change my behavior within the next 7 days. So when I see it on that scorecard in the L10, I'm saying I'm fixing this in 7 days. I want that anxiety, I want that tension to change my behavior. If you're allowing, and integrator, I'm looking at you, if you're allowing that to be red week over week over week over week, we're losing the purpose of the scorecard, which is it's like a gutter if it's dripping in my house and I'm the house owner. I stop hearing it after 2 weeks. But someone walks into my house week 3 and they're like, Dan, what's good with that gutter, right? That is super annoying. I can hear it, right? It's still, the problem still exists, but I stop hearing it if I allow it for a long enough time. So do not get used to red. If it's red, we want to be asking the question, how do I get it green in the next 7 days? And if it's truly impossible to get it green in the next 7 days, we probably have set the goal too high. I don't want you to just always change the goal if it's constantly red, but when you IDS something that's chronically red, you should be asking, what is the root issue, right? Is it that the goal is too high, or is it that we're not actually taking it seriously and changing our behavior on the next week? So some do's and don'ts. Don't create a perfectly precise measurable, right? What we want to do is simple, accurate measurables we all get. Don't put monthly P&L numbers on the scorecard, right? This is not in lieu of that monthly P&L review, right? Have that monthly P&L review. Again, this is about driving action. We want to have those weekly activity-based measurables here that ultimately drive that P&L. So again, still continue to have your monthly P&L, but make sure that we have those weekly activity-based measurables. Don't set qualitative goals, right? Sometimes I'll have like the happy customers goal or customer satisfaction goal that's really hard to measure initially. Maybe you do it longer term with, surveys or stuff. But if you don't have that, don't put like yes or no things unless you absolutely have to. You want to use the headlines to report on things like employee satisfaction, client satisfaction, or other qualitative data. That's what the headline sections in the L10 is actually for. Don't set stretch goals. As I mentioned, the point of this is to make sure that if it's red, we can get it green within the next 7 days. So set goals realistically, and if it dips below the line, we can have that IDS to get it back above the line immediately. Don't set year over year or quarter over quarter goals unless, again, we absolutely have to, and it drives that weekly action. But in most instances, this is where people they say we need to know this information. Point you back to number 2 here is if you need that P&L review with the quarter over quarter, year over year goals on a monthly basis, do it. But remember, this weekly scorecard, the leadership scorecard, and all scorecards is about getting that focus on what we need to do each week to make it a great quarter and ultimately a great year. And again, don't have goals that change every week, right? If your scorecard is so complex that it needs to be evaluated and changed every week, you're using your L10s to completely change your scorecard, not actually addressing the big issues that really are holding your company back. So the way you want to do this is actually look at it. When we have that quarterly meeting, look at your scorecard and say, let's adjust the scorecard then. What does the scorecard need to look like from a measurables perspective? And then what does the goal on average each week need to look like to get us to that outcome? So at the end of the day, I'll end with this quote. That which is measured in improves. That which is measured and reported on improves exponentially. And at the highest level, that's what this scorecard is that when you measure an action and you have to report on it, one person has to report on it. It's that tension, it's that peer pressure, it's that not wanting to get to that L10 and be embarrassed, right? Or be constantly read. It's that drives output, right? It's that action, the discipline, the behaviors every week that gets you to that outcome. That's what that scorecard is ultimately all about. So that's what I got for you guys today. If you have any questions, my name again is Dan Bubniak. Email Dan at outpaceenterprises.com. And I will leave it there. So have a great day.